CJ Buck, CEO of Buck Knives, and had a neat opportunity to sit down and visit with Larrin Thomas here, so I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Larrin Thomas, so I am a metallurgist, so I am famous now for developing MagnaCut, and I have a website, Knife Steel Nerds, I'm a big nerd on knife steel, mostly coming from my father, Larrin Thomas, who is best known for making stainless Damascus, including for companies like Buck. So we have definitely a shared past a little bit in that respect. And in recent months, I came out with a new book called The Story of Knife Steel, which is a history of metallurgists and knife companies and knife makers in the steels they chose and how they heat treated them. And there are 3 separate sections on Buck Knives because of the many important contributions that were made to the industry. So I really enjoy learning more about Buck. Of course, it was a company I knew about, I was a fan of, lots of classic knife designs, some awesome models. But to learn more of the history and the family, going from generation to generation, that was awesome to learn about.
Well, I do notice that the collaborations that we're doing with you all seem to be on very classic patterns, so that does seem to resonate with you, the more classic.
Yeah, I was working on the book while we started talking about it, and so I like classic styling. For me, Buck with the classic style, you can't. It's hard to recreate that. You're a new company, I'm going to make an old style knife. When you've been making them since the beginning, it's just a little bit different feel to it. And so when I started talking to Buck about the collaboration, I was all in on mixing the classic and the modern. Use what Buck has learned in the past and today to make an awesome new knife. So.
Yeah, that's it. We were talking, so we got a chance to sit down at Blade Show. So we were having a couple of conversations, and one of the things I remember talking to you about was how, from Buck Knives' standpoint, we don't jump steels very often. And we chatted about it from a heat treating standpoint, from a learning standpoint. It takes us a long time for us to dial in exactly how we want to heat treat something and where we get the best results. So we don't jump very often. We tend to stick. We tend to stick with stuff once we discover it. And so the MagnaCut was really one of the first new steels we had done in a long time. So if you would just talk a little bit about where that idea came from, like what you were going for.
Yeah, so I was excited about knife steel from the time I was a teenager. My dad started bringing me to knife shows. I would meet legends, like members of the Buck family. And, to me, they were just regular guys at the show. Didn't think twice about half of them. But it gave me a chance to meet a bunch of industry legends. And one of the things I was most excited about were new steels. So a big one was S30V that came out in my teens. And the Crucible guys were very involved. Crucible is a steel company that developed and makes S30V. And they would send metallurgists to the shows, and I would go and pester them about everything. Like, why is there 2% molybdenum in the steel? Why'd you pick 4% vanadium? Why didn't you increase the nitrogen content? And, they were always very nice and patient. The knife industry is great. The steel industry is great. And so I always loved this idea of making a new steel. And when I pursued degrees in metallurgy, this is really what I was targeting from the beginning. I love this idea of developing a steel from scratch. And when I started doing Knife Steel Nerds, I tested all kinds of steels, and I could predict their behavior based on the composition and the microstructure. The elements that we added, and then what does the structure of the steel look like after. So I came up with ideas about what the ideal microstructure looks like.
Okay.
And we were able to model a stainless steel that would have this ideal microstructure based on a composition. And so then I went to Crucible and I said, can we make this? I'm just a metallurgist at a completely different company. I don't even work on knife steel at my company. I work on automotive steel. So I had to talk them into it, and I just had to cross my fingers that it would actually work. Because if it didn't work, they'd probably say, thanks for coming to us, but it didn't work out. And so with MagnaCut, what we were able to do is have an improvement in the toughness, wear resistance balance. So if you increase one of those, the other one goes down. So increasing both of them at the same time is difficult or impossible. And we did that by having a microstructure that looks like a non-stainless steel, but in a stainless steel.
Okay.
And that's what is the big excitement about MagnaCut. And so it's great that Buck Knives is getting in on MagnaCut. Like you said, a lot of the end buyers don't really understand the logistics, the issues that are created. And it's not even that a new steel will be a challenging steel to work with. It's just you try it, you put it in the grinder, and it doesn't grind the same way, as the other steel. And so there's just 100 little steps where it's going to behave a little bit different than the other steel, and you got to make all of those adjustments. So there's definitely an investment involved. So it's exciting when Buck introduces a new steel.
Well, it's nice to have something that actually delivers a performance like that. That it's worth the effort. So from a knife guy standpoint. So I'm the field metallurgist. You could probably think of me as the analog version of the digital version. So I take something out in the woods and see how it works, and come back and change something and go see how it works, and come back and change something and go see how it works. So it's fascinating to me, people who approach these things from the microstructure, as you were talking about earlier, just such a different way to approach how to improve a steel. I remember, so we were doing a gut hook and trying to make a gut hook that actually worked. And it was difficult. And what we ended up doing was just making hundreds and hundreds of different shapes, pick the ones that worked, make a dozen variations of that particular shape, picked out which one of those worked the best, and eventually, after probably 500 samples, came up with a certain geometry that worked. So to me, that's the analog version. That's the layman's, the knife guy's version of how to do that versus the scientist or the metallurgist, how to do that. I just think that's utterly fascinating.
Yeah, that's what's fun and challenging about engineering, is a lot of times you think something's going to work, and then when you actually try it, you're like, oh, it didn't work, And
but at least you know why.
Yeah. So iterative design can be a good way of doing things. You take a stab at something, you don't have to get too attached to that attempt. You give it a try and you're like, okay, it's hanging up right here. How can we change that? And so I see this as more and more of a trend, in the industry and engineering in general, is that, you try something as quickly as you can. You get something to a customer or try it yourself or both, to find out where are the pain points, where are the failure points, and get it to work. So.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I know I was just, so this is one that we're coming out with a little bit later. It's our 501 pattern with no rear bolster, but ebony handles. And I was just sitting here playing with it. And that's the beauty of a knife is when you just feel like playing with a knife, you've done something right. But so talk a little bit about, from a scientific standpoint of, now I know a harder steel gives a better bearing surface. So as this knife's rotating and rubbing against the rocker, it just feels really smooth, which is a very high quality sense. Why does it do that? Where
the softer something gets, the more it's like rubber, we'll say.
Okay.
Soft rubber, it just rubs and it deforms and it doesn't have the same clean feel that a really high hardness material does. And so on a more limited scale, we also see that with steel, where if they're very soft steels or they're prone to galling, then they have issues, as opposed to something that's higher in hardness.
Oh man, you can sure feel it. You can totally feel it. I get a chance to talk to different groups, sportsmen's groups, knife collection groups, so people with interests in knives, both from a collecting standpoint as well as just from a hardcore use standpoint. So we talk about the different steels, why Buck uses the different steels. If corrosion resistance is what you're most concerned about, if edge retention is what you're most concerned about, if ductility is what you're most concerned about, or some balance of the three, you can kind of pick and choose which steel. But I also get the opportunity to speak in fairly simplistic terms on heat treat. And it's kind of a branding story for us because we've been doing our own heat treat for a long time. It's something my father brought into our company. It's the relationship with Paul Boss, who was a hot rod buddy of my Uncle Frank. So they go back to the late 60s. So, we've been doing our own heat treat this whole time. It's been a passion, almost a religious experience for us, is doing our own heat treat. So if you would, could you kind of describe a little bit about what is actually happening within the steel that's changing it, that's changing those properties through just the application of heat, and why, if the heat treat isn't done properly, what might not happen?
Okay, so a nice tiny question to answer. So when you get the steel from the manufacturer, it comes annealed. It's dead soft, ready for like drilling holes and grinding. And so it's not ready for a knife. This would be a very mushy edge. When you heat it up, what we're doing are dissolving the carbides. When you anneal it and made it dead soft, they took as much carbon out of solution and into carbides. And they made the carbides a little bit bigger so that it's more machinable. So that's as soft as it can be. The carbon is out of solution. So we heated it up hot, and when it gets hot, it turns to a new phase called austenite. So that's a fancy term.
Yep.
But this is really easy to see. Bladesmiths know all the time when it transforms to austenite because you can use a magnet, because austenite is non-magnetic. So this is an example of transformations that can occur in the steel and really change its properties.
Okay.
It goes from magnetic to non-magnetic. Another property of austenite is that it has a high solubility for carbon. So it can handle lots of carbon all inside, in between the iron atoms. Okay. So instead of locked up in a carbide, it's now in between the iron atoms. The hotter you go, the more carbide is dissolved and the more carbon is in solution. So the more carbon in solution, the harder it's going to be after we quench. The quenching operation essentially locks in the carbon. And then the austenite transforms to a new low temperature phase called martensite. Okay. So martensite, again, another fancy term, but what we need to know is it's similar to the ferrite structure of annealed steel, but it's distorted by carbon. So it creates a new distorted structure, which is really high in strength, high in hardness.
Now, are these structures, are they molecules? Like, is this a building of a molecule?
So they're called crystal structures. They're not properly called molecules. Okay. So steel is not molecular. But they are different structures. So like we can have different phases of any material. An easy one to talk about is water. You can boil water to a gas, you can freeze it to a solid, or we use it all the time as a liquid. Those are different phases. You can also have multiple solid phases. And so a solid phase is a different atomic structure. So the atoms are actually in a different arrangement. Okay. And that's why the properties can be so different. So we go from ferrite at room temperature, we heat it up hot, to austenite, and then we quench to make a new phase called martensite. And of course, they've been doing this for hundreds, thousands of years. And so when we balance a heat treatment, part of it is how much carbide will we dissolve, how much carbon do we get in solution. And to add other complications, with stainless steels, there are chromium carbides. And so the hotter we go, the more chromium goes in solution. The more chromium that goes in solution, the better the corrosion resistance will be. Okay. So that's one of the balancing acts, is if we heat it up hotter and hotter, we can get higher hardness and better corrosion resistance when we quench. So another problem that can occur in heat treating is that all of the austenite will not transform to martensite when you quench. Okay. And that is called retained austenite. And we overcome this through cryo treatments. So the cryo treatment will convert more of the austenite. So when we talk about martensite transformation, there's a temperature where it starts and a temperature where it finishes. The more carbon and chromium is in solution, the lower those transformations go. Okay. And so you have to go cryo to then get into the transformation range. So I'm trying to explain this simply. But even with cryo, you can end up with extra retained austenite, and that makes the steel softer. It will go from, so you're heating, you try different heat treatments hotter and hotter. The performance will get better in some ways by it gets harder and more corrosion resistant. Then it'll start falling off a cliff. Sometimes it even measures almost as hard. Instead of 64 Rockwell as quenched, it's 60, and you're like, okay, that's not so bad. But it'll start behaving like it's much softer, because this retained austenite, it yields easily, and so you get edge deformation and things.
Okay.
So, one of the balancing acts as a heat treater is trying to find an appropriate temperature where you haven't overheated. With simple steels, like with 5160 that Buck has used in the past, those grain growth is more of an issue. With stainless steels, there's so much carbide in them, those carbides will pin grain boundaries and they never really grow very big. With a simple steel, it's easier to overheat them. And you dissolve all the carbide and the grains grow really big, and then it becomes very brittle and bad.
Okay.
So that austenitizing temperature, that high temperature before you quench, it's one of the most critical temperatures that you choose. The other one is tempering. So after we quench to hard martensite, it's brittle. We've got all that carbon locked in there. It's this distorted structure, super hard. It also breaks easily. When you temper, you heat it up to a low temperature. Like, you can do this in your kitchen oven. So knife makers do this all the time. They set the oven to 400 and they stick it in there. And mom comes later and she's like, "What is this in my oven?"
Knife pie.
Yeah, you're like, "Sorry, mom. There's oil smell in the kitchen and everything." So you heat it up to a low temperature, and some of the carbon is able to come out as little tiny tempering carbides. They're called transition carbides. And so that relaxes the steel some and gives it higher ductility and higher toughness. So you lose a little bit of hardness for the trade-off of more toughness. So that's another one of the big trade-offs, is what tempering temperature you choose.
Okay.
So if you go hotter, it gets softer and tougher, but you want to maintain some hardness. So you're balancing things. Another element with manufacturing is when you are grinding and sharpening, you can create heat in the blade. And so if you temper hotter, that gives you a little more factor of safety, because you can heat up to just about where the tempering temperature was before you start to change the properties.
It's interesting. I've seen that go both ways, where we work harden and then we work anneal. I've seen it. I've seen it. So it's fascinating to hear kind of the science aspect behind it, because on this side of the table, it's okay. I dug into it a little too hard. I burned it, and now it's just not going to hold its temper like it was. Or you mentioned earlier about edge deformation, and where explaining to people that when you get something down to a razor edge, it's there's so little structure to the surface area. Like there's nothing to support it if it's not hard enough to support itself, where you do something and now you've got that bend in your edge. It's fascinating to see what goes on in the field compared to what's actually causing
I
it.
observed this once myself. So I've made a handful of custom knives. I don't call myself a knife maker.
Okay.
But I was making a kitchen knife and I ground it too thin. And it was 63 Rockwell steel. It should be really hard, but it was so thin, you could just put it on your fingernail and you could deform it. So if you go thin enough, anything will break.
Yeah, aluminum foil.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like.
Wow. One of the things we've talked about here is working within our marketing department to try and really show people what's happening, so that they understand, because the heat treat's we've always felt it's just so important. And even though different people might be using the same steels, if you haven't heat treated it properly, you're going to get a completely different performance out of it. I mean, it's almost like a different steel. I mean, as you're talking, I'm translating structure, where if you create the structure or don't create the structure, you've got two different materials there, even though you really started with the same basic cake batter. You end up with cake on one side or a croissant on the other side, but it all really kind of started with the same basic ingredients.
So I did test Buck heat treating once.
Okay.
So along with Buck QA, so Jeff Hubbard, he asked me to test the heat treatment of 420 high carbon.
Okay.
And I said, "Jeff, why would I test? This is the most famous heat treatment in the knife industry, is the Boss heat treating of 420 high carbon. So it's legendary in that it is a relatively simple steel, but it performs very well. So people are often surprised by its performance." And I said, "Why would I mess with that why would I want to make a bunch of people a buck angry by telling them they've been doing it wrong? So but he asked me to test it. So I tested it for hardness and for corrosion resistance and toughness. And it tested all high marks for everything. So I was very happy to go back to Jeff and tell him, like, everything is
excellent.
good to go.
Excellent.
It's all 10 out of 10, as good as you can heat treat 420 high carbon.
Yeah, you try not to ask a question you don't already know the answer to.
Yeah.
No, it's an interesting story with the 420HC, because when we first started looking into it, it was to try and get a softer steel for fine blanking. So we'd been using 440C forever, holds a terrific edge, built our reputation on holding an edge, and a lot of it was how we were heat treating the 440C steel. But we also had a lot of issues with the 440C. The little half moon snaps out of the edge, broken blades, inclusions that just created weak spots. And so the 420HC fixed a lot of that, as long as we could get it hard enough to hold a decent edge. When they first introduced us to the steel, they told us that we would have a range, and I wanted to say it was like 56 to 58 Rockwell on the C scale. And 58 is what we were targeting. 56 is kitchen knife-esque, fillet knife-esque, maybe even 54, but too soft to be a buck knife. So we were worried that we couldn't have a range.
Yeah.
So that's where the Paul Boss mystique came in.
Yeah, the magic.
Where we were able to maintain 57.5 to 58.5, 100% consistently. And it so shocked, and I want to say it was Allegheny, but it so shocked the people providing us the steel, because they wanted to be able to say better stuff about their steel. So they came out to review our process. And I just remember that was a nice compliment. The most sincerest compliment was having people from the factory providing you the steel to come out and investigate why you're getting such good results with their product.
Yeah.
It was neat. It was a good compliment.
Well, and there are some people in the knife industry that see the carbon content of 420 high carbon, and they think it is a downgrade.
Yeah, half what it should be.
Yeah. So 440C has 1% carbon or so, and there's a certain group of old enthusiasts that say 1% carbon or it's not knife steel. But the reduced carbon, especially if you can keep the hardness up at a good level, that gives you really high toughness. You mentioned the 440C chipping issues that you sometimes saw. And so 420HC, it has much higher toughness than 440C. It's in a completely different league. So 420HC is about as tough as you can get for that 58 Rockwell or so. So, there are trade-offs, but sometimes people say, if it's not a high-end steel, it must not be tough. But no, we're talking trade-offs here. So the 420 high carbon, it's very sharpenable, it has really high toughness, and with a good hardness and heat treatment, it can hold an edge pretty well.
I'll encounter folks in the field that take really good care of their stuff, and I'll encounter folks in the field that don't take good care of their stuff at all. And so, the S30V or D2, or there's some monster performing steels that don't ace the test on the corrosion resistance. So you have to take care of them. Yeah. They're harder to sharpen. You have to take care of them. If you do, they will perform amazingly for you. And there are other people that actually carry their knife more than use it. It's kind of their, hunting duffers like me, where you don't always get something every season. So you may just be carrying it for a few years before you get to put it to...
Yeah, there's plenty of very dull buck knives out there.
Yes,
and it's not the fault of the knife.
Yeah, the corrosion sometimes is more damaging to the edge than use. And so, I tell people that, there's choices to be made depending upon how you're going to use something, how you're going to carry it, what type of care you want to do. That can also dictate the steel choice for you.
Well, the number one way to increase the performance of a knife is to sharpen it. So.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
Well, thanks, CJ.
Oh, it was a pleasure. It's good chatting with you again.
Anytime.